Jennifer from Lansdale, Pennsylvania again. We got Jen Nelson in Brookfield. Welcome, Jen. Milan from Michigan. Sally, Randy, and Nick from Ambler, Pennsylvania. So glad you're here, guys. Porter Beach, Indiana represented. Joanna, thanks for being here with your 3 sons. Lisa and Rick Gillis in River Forest, Illinois. And we've got 2 in Willowbrook. Thanks so much, guys. We'll let that keep going. Please keep checking in. But I'll go ahead and move us forward. We have a big agenda tonight. So I'm Anna Garcia Doyle. I'm the executive director of the One Earth Film Festival. I want to welcome you to our virtual screening and discussion, which we hope will present rich opportunities for learning and provide a brave and safe space for important conversations that matter deeply right now in our country and across the globe. One Earth's 10th season theme is inspiring change. In watching The Nature Makers, the term extreme conservation was new to me, but it was inspiring and I connected with it so much because it's what we need to do to meet the urgencies of our climate crisis. In this film, look out for the incredible ways the prairie dog colonies communicate, and after the film, engage in our discussion of extreme conservation, as well as conservation equity and urban conservation. I don't want to go any farther without thanking our wonderful sponsors and partners. So thank you tonight to the Field Museum, the Nature Conservancy, the Sierra Club, and the Village of River Forest. A couple of other quick notes. At the end of this event, please share your experiences on the survey linked at the top of your video window so that One Earth can keep improving what we do. And also, if your circumstances allow, please donate to support One Earth's nonprofit year-round screening events, youth programs, and more at oneearthfilmfest.org.
We are thrilled you're with us as One Earth Film Fest celebrates 10 years of inspiring change and utilizes the power of film to spark change on topics of environment and those intersected with environment, like social justice. The fest has had to adapt to a virtual format, but we strive to stay true to our model. While we're not physically together, we are here together, live, virtually, still able to create community, become aware of issues, engage in dialogue, and be inspired to act. African-American activist Angela Davis said, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world." The stories in our fest films reflect that possibility. Our collective actions will achieve that possibility. Our event will take place in 4 parts. We'll introduce you to some folks who will help us have a great discussion after the film. We'll then watch it together. Then afterwards, we'll unpack the film's themes in a facilitated Q&A with our wonderful panelists. Please participate by using the chat to share thoughts, ideas, or questions. We'll end by sharing concrete actions you can take to be part of the solution. These actions come from our panelists and other action partners. As we live current movements and reframe narratives around justice, environment, and bringing innovative, equitable solutions to our climate crisis, we're hopeful for the future. I am grateful to the knowledgeable filmmakers, film subjects, facilitators, and panelists joining this and other fest events. They'll guide discussions to help spark and sustain actions for the protection of our One Earth and for the just treatment of its resources and its people. We've found that shared agreements help keep our conversations safe and respectful. Please observe these agreements when participating. Put aside your preconceptions, acknowledge your privilege, internalize what you've learned, approach the conversation with respect. Engage your active listening, use I statements and get comfortable with your own story. Acknowledge Native peoples who came before us in protecting our land. One last thing before we meet our facilitator and program participants. If you're active on social media, tell people this is happening. Amplify these voices and be part of the community we're building here together. The hashtag for the festival is hashtag OEFF 2021. Thanks again to all of you for being here. And now I'd like to turn it over to our facilitator to introduce themselves, the panelists, and our film.
Hi, my name is Amy Rosenthal, and I'll be your discussion facilitator this evening. I'm the director of the Field Museum's Keller Science Action Center, an interdisciplinary team that translates museum science into results for conservation and quality of life. You know, we often watch movies and then walk out of the theater without really reflecting on what we've seen, how we felt about it, or what implications it has for our lives. Today, we plan to have a rich, thought-provoking dialogue, sparked by the Nature Makers and joined by some of these incredible direction-setting panelists you'll meet soon. We look forward to having you participate too, bringing your reflections and questions into the room via chat, and also exploring ways to take related action. I'd like to briefly introduce the panelists that are going to be part of our post-film program. Amaris Alanis Ribeiro is director of North Park Village Nature Center in Chicago. Creedell, or Cree Walls, is a youth advocate and nature enthusiast. We'll learn more about them after the film. Now, before we watch our first film, we want you to enjoy a 4-minute piece titled A Few Feet Away, directed by Matthew Taylor, winner of the postgraduate honorable mention in our Young Filmmakers contest. Matthew is a talented filmmaker and recent graduate of Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi, Texas. The Nature Makers will immediately follow A Few Feet Away. Make sure you stay tuned for a post-film conversation. Now, it's my pleasure to invite Scott Saunders, inimitable director of The Nature Makers, to introduce this film.
I'm coming through now? Okay. Okay, good. You can hear me? Everybody hears me? Yes? Thumbs up? Okay, good. All right. As I was saying, thanks so much, Amy, and thanks so much to One Earth. I've been so impressed with what you guys are doing, to your commitment, to the work you're doing, and thank you for including the film. It's really great to be part of this forum. And also a shout out to my co-panelists, Amaris and Cree and Amy. I'm really looking forward to this discussion because I love the idea that we can use the film as a kind of jumping off point to talk about people's on the ground conservation work. So this is just the kind of thing we envisioned when we set out to make the film. So before we roll the film tonight, I just wanted to talk about a couple of things. When we began shooting, the first thing we shot, we shot this film with 3 different species and the conservationists who were trying to keep them alive. And we began filming in Nebraska with the sandhill cranes. And I was really excited because I thought we'd get to film these amazing cranes in their natural setting. And I was a little disappointed because every time we would point the camera, there would always be, there'd be a cornfield, or there'd be a factory, or there'd be a coal-fired power plant, or there'd be some river that had been completely impacted by humans. So, we never really got to film the cranes in their natural setting. But then I realized that the human landscape was in fact the crane's new natural. There wasn't really a purely natural setting left, and everything really about the crane's lives and the lives of the prairie dogs, who you'll also see, and the humpback chub, is impacted by humans and human development. But here's the thing, and this is really one of the main points of the film. Not all human impacts are negative, and some impacts are actually quite positive. And so that means that this film is actually a hopeful film. So I hope you'll enjoy this hopeful film, and I hope you'll be around in 70 minutes to participate in this conversation we're going to have after the film. So thank you very much.
Well, hello, everyone. I think we're back. And I'm wondering, what are some of the scenes, people, or lines in the film that stood out for you? Add those to the chat. Actually, I'm seeing some come in. Conservation is keeping the wild alive. Support the people who have the guts to keep these species alive. From Susan. From Wendy, I'm hearing, as a 30-plus year conservation professional, this movie was like a warm hug. Thank you. From Terry, it takes a huge amount of work to do what nature does naturally. From Wendy. Oh, from Toma Maid. Prairie dogs should be the mascots of our green future. Suzanne also, this was my favorite, loved the prairie dog. Kathy mentioned, love the last words. Monica. Oh, more from Monica. We see, I so appreciate these people for everything they do to help save what animals and wilderness that they can. They are all wonderful for caring enough to do what they do. I couldn't agree enough. What an incredible, powerful film. Gorgeous images. We saw so much about that care that everyone in the film was taking for nature and the species there. We hear from someone else named Amy. I think it's unfortunate the Sandhill Crane story started with, "This is not for sissies." Put me off, but I stayed with it and loved the crane story. I'm glad the story moved you in the end. From Charlene, we hear, as we age and see the end of our time on Earth, important to know that there are young people with vision and passion to make sure the planet's ecosystems will survive. Well, we want to hear more from all of you, but now it is my great pleasure to reintroduce our panel tonight to hear their reflections. And we're going to start with Scott Saunders, who's the director of the Nature Makers. Scott has directed, co-written, and produced 3 feature films and over 20 shorts. The Nature Makers is his first documentary, if you can believe it. His third feature, The Technical Writer, premiered in competition at the Sundance Film Festival. Scott was named one of Variety's 10 digital video directors to watch. He's also a Creative Capital Fellow and the recipient of the Someone to Watch Award at the Independent Spirit Awards. Amaris Alanis Ribeiro is the center director of North Park Village Nature Center at the Chicago Park District, who will also join us on our panel. Amaris is a conservation leader and award-winning environmental educator, bringing bridging human, plant, and environmental justice. Currently, she directs the operation of a public facility with 46 acres of a nature preserve in Chicago, consisting of prairie, woodland, and wetland ecosystems. And finally, Credell Walls is a youth advocate and nature enthusiast. For 20 years, Cree has been a youth advocate and community engagement specialist. He nurtures the love of nature in many people, especially the young, now with the Forest Preserves of Cook County, but he's also worked with the Jane Goodall Institute and the Garfield Park Conservatory Alliance. Now, please, I ask all of you in the audience, add your questions to the chat. We're going to try to get to as many as we can, and we're really looking forward to a lively discussion today. So I'm looking here, and I hear, Cree, would you, or actually, let's start with Cree. How does this work in the film reflect or remind you of the work that you're doing or have done? How does it relate to your experience here in Chicago? Cree, I think maybe there's a mute button.
I was playing a joke on everyone. No, I wasn't. we're unmuted now. Thank you. I was saying first, I want to first of all thank the One Earth Film Festival for having me be here, part of the panel, and Scott for putting together an amazing film with taped. I was really impressed, and I developed a really deep appreciation for the passion that everyone had doing the work that they was doing for these amazing animals. And watching this film made me think a lot about the work that I do with the Forest Preserve and have done over my careers with numbers of different types of young people from all backgrounds when they're trying to make a difference in the world, when they're trying to do service learning campaigns and projects that shows the care for people, animals, and the environment, that level of passion and commitment to stick it through to the end. and overcoming the different barriers that might be in front of you. Whether you have all the knowledge or limited knowledge, you don't give up because you want to see change happen for the environment. So a lot of the work that I've done with young people have that same type of passion that these wonderful people in this film possessed. And yeah, I mean, I'll say more later, but I was just really impressed with the work that everyone was doing.
Yeah. Alanis, does that jive with what your experience has been as well?
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Amy, Cree, Scott, and One Earth Film Festival as well. I echo a lot of what Cree said. As a part of a conservation and environmental education, being able to engage people in the work of the science. I've done a lot of work with youth, and also help them go into conservation careers. And all of that said, I also feel that there was a beautiful connection with the various animals that were featured. So we really understood this respect for the species in a way that learned about their behavior, their characteristics, their beauty, their strength. And I think that that also is important to doing conservation work, of really looking at species in a mutually respectful way.
Amaris, that was powerful. Scott, is that the response you were hoping for is in producing and making this film? What kind of an impact were you hoping to have on your audience?
When I started, I didn't have any particular outcome in mind, but I think what they both Korea and Amari speak to is very much in line with what I experienced while making the film. Um, it. I always took a lot of pride because I always thought independent filmmakers were like the hardest working people I knew. And I always thought that was great. And I always really admired my friends for how dedicated and passionate they were, and how kind of selfless and dogged they were. And so once I started hanging out with conservationists, I was like, oh, I get these people. They're my tribe. They do a different thing, but I've just felt immediately comfortable with them and at home with them. And so I think that was not at all necessarily what we set out to make when we made the film, but that it just became evident that the passion and the hard work was going to be kind of central to the story of the film.
Yeah,
If that makes
Scott,
sense.
it does. It's reminds me of the hardworking team of folks that I work with and the experiences that Cree and Amaris have described, the youth that they're engaged with too, at least the hardworking, passionate part for conservation workers and leaders. There are more questions for you coming in about the film. One question is, what other wildlife and locations did you investigate or consider including in the film? Of all the possibilities for wildlife rescue and restoration projects that are happening, how did you end up selecting these?
Um, no, these were really selected because we were interested in the kinds of projects that would almost make you think again about what conservation was. So the idea of people using heavy equipment to protect a species just seemed absolutely improbable to me. And I love that kind of delicious irony, because I felt like it would make people really think about what our impact on the world is. And and I just like irony too. So, and it was the same thing with the prairie dogs. The fact that people would use equipment to dig artificial burrows for prairie dogs. Like, why do prairie dogs need artificial burrows? They're perfectly capable of digging burrows on their own, but because their habitats have been so impacted, they need a little help at times because their numbers have been so decimated. And it's the same thing with flying fish around in helicopters. So that happened because Octay Ortobasi, the film cinematographer, was talking to a friend who works in the Grand Canyon, telling her about the film, and she said, "Oh, I've got a perfect story for you. I'm involved with these people who fly fish around in helicopters." And we were like, "Yes, that's the perfect story." So some of the stories just kind of found us, and we found others, but they were all stories about these kind of extreme efforts that conservationists were making.
Yes, I think one of the quotes, I think Noel says, this is extreme conservation. And Claudia actually asks, there's a quote in this film that says, a lot of people burn out, but if you feel passionate about the natural world, you just keep doing it. I want to ask Cree and Amaris, can you relate to that, what the folks in the film were going through? Do you have any stories or examples to share?
I studied ecology and animal behavior in college, and all of my excursions, both in school and taking teens, a lot of the work does take time to see results. And then you are also in the middle of the wilderness and you're waiting sometimes to see a particular species and you're like, it's here, but it's not, they're hidden for good reasons. And so you're just kind of in the middle of, like the backcountry, like described in the film, waiting patiently, and not able to see the results. It is very physically tiring, and also something that sometimes you have to come back and explain to your families, and especially for youth of color, who, conservation and these type of careers and doing hard labor, it's a little bit challenging to come back and explain to your families, like, this is what I'm doing, and it's for this particular species. I promise it's going to do good work for the species. We just don't know when, and it's long term and rewarding. And so the burnout definitely, for different reasons of just waiting for that outcome, and also just kind of being able to explain the conservation and labor field to people. There is that burnout.
Yeah, Cree, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does. About the appropriate story to tell. This makes me think a lot about, and again, this relates to a teen program that I used to run at the Garfield Park Conservatory Alliance. For 2 years, we were trying to connect these young people to nature, get them exposed to tropical and desert plants. And for 2 years, I feel like we were really successful with that. But it was only a 2 year program. And the young people said, "Hey, Cree, the program is done and is done. What do we do now?" And I was like, "I don't know. What do you guys want to do?" And the shorter version is that they decided that we should raise money to go to Peru to see these plants in their natural habitat. And mind you, this is 2004. At that time, I had never traveled out of the country, never had a passport, but we titled this story "The Blind Leading the Blind." So it took us 5 months to raise $30,000, get these young people vaccinated, do all of this educational training that needed to happen. And midway through the process, I was giving up because there were a lot of things that were going on that worked against us. But it was the power of the young people that said, Cree, we've worked really hard for this. We got to still do it. And replacements. Let's make this happen. And we did. We did. I tell you this story now in a very calm manner, but through that process and at the end, when we came back from Peru and told our story to the whole west side of Chicago, or the portion that was there, I cried. I cried because of I felt like we were really successful. These young people had gotten connected to nature to the point where not only did not want to stay in their backyards, they wanted to get out of the country and see these plants in their natural habitat. You know, we gave up a little bit, but we persevered and we made it happen.
So how was the trip?
Oh, it was amazing. And you know what was amazing about the trip for me? There were a lot of amazing things about it. You know, seeing animals and insects three times the size that we would see some of them in Chicago, not all of them. But the part that really touched me the most was probably the first few days on the Amazon River. We were on the Amazon River for 4 hours, and without saying anything, this might sound small to everyone else, but without saying anything, they pulled out their journals and they started writing about their experience. And me and another instructor, we were like, look, they're writing, they're journaling. We didn't have to say anything. And at the end of, and I'm skipping over so much, but at the end of the experience, they put together a wonderful book about what they've learned. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was starting to get a little choked up. Haven't told this story in a while, but I was just really happy that they've grown on that trip from being young people who had never left their neighborhoods to being in a country where they're speaking another language. And you know the interesting thing and I'm trying not to get off on topic. When we made it back to Chicago, they were not happy to be back just because of the friendliness of the people in Peru compared to those in Chicago and whom they communicated with.
Yeah, that is a powerful story about people reaching for their dreams, for new links that it's hard even to imagine how you get there. And I think that's some of what we saw in the film. James asks something about this, in fact. And Scott, I wanted to send it to you. He asks, I've heard the term rewilding recently in the context of land use by ordinary people. Although it might not be enough to save endangered species, can it still help biodiversity? Is it a fast growing and promising trend in the US? Did you see some of this as you were making your film?
Um, Nobody that I spoke with ever really used that term rewilding, but that was essentially what they were doing. So in the case of the prairie dogs, for instance, they were putting prairie dogs back in an area where prairie dogs had not existed for a while. So they were essentially rewilding that Native American tribal land. So that's essentially what was going on. I think that I'm not really the one to speak to this. I'm sure Kriya and Amaris could speak to the issue of rewilding more, but that's definitely what you saw in the film. People bringing these species back to places where they hadn't existed for a while, but where they had traditionally existed in the past.
Yeah, so I want to see Cree and Amaris. What about from your perspectives? Is rewilding something you see in the work that you do, particularly in the Chicago region?
Sure. So at North Park Village Nature Center, we're a 46-acre within Chicago, and so the idea of ecological restoration comes up all the time. Like, what does that mean? What was this land like before? And if you think about Chicago, in our area, a little bit further away from the Great Lakes, we were a wet woodland. The work that would take to restore it or rewild it, as someone might use that term, to a wet woodland would be incredibly challenging, expensive, and then just did it actually make sense given all the tremendous land changes that have happened over time, anywhere from grazing to then we were a very interesting story of where we're at was a tree nursery and then a tuberculosis sanitarium, and so the land was reshaped several times, and at one point when it was the 70s, a wetland was dug out as more of a pond for leisure. But in terms of restoration, we turned it into a wetland for biodiversity of a wetland species. So it was, a nice pond. You can walk around it, and which you can still do, but we've significantly seen the difference of biodiversities of particular bird species because of this wetland. So sometimes you can really manipulate to try to, come back to what that space could be in terms of biodiversity, but it is a really complicated thing. What I like to think more about when I think of restoration work, I think more of it like what is our system change, and so thinking in systems both for humans as part of nature, and these animals as part of our system, and so having that systemic relationship with them, and a systemic relationship in terms of restoration. So if we're putting something in and what's coming out is all part of the same system, and so I rather think a little bit more about that long term systemic change to our ecology, as coexisting, and so lots of changes in our environment, but really thinking about long term resiliency and how we can all be in harmony.
Yeah, so system change, rewilding is shifting systems into places that are cohabitable by people and native species. Cree, is that something that you found as a theme coming out in the journaling of the youth you were engaging with?
Honestly, I cannot recall because it was so long ago. It was so long ago. But what I was going to say is that although with the Forest Reserve, we have 11 different departments, and so and we have our wildlife division, and they do the bulk of that kind of work. With 70,000 acres of land, there is a lot that has changed, and unfortunately, I can't really speak to that because that's not my strength. But as it pertains to doing a ton of restoration work, removing invasive plants, and trying to make sure that the native plants can grow there, you know, that's something that I know that we do well with. So I really can't answer that question.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating one and a tough one. Rewilding has come up more recently, I think,
That's a new
in
term for me.
conservation terms.
Yeah.
Exactly. But one of the perennial challenges is a question actually that Lisa has. She asks, where are some of these conservation groups getting funding for their endeavors? What are those sources? Crystal also asks, how do we contribute, both in terms of treasure and in terms of time for these efforts? And I'm going to want to hear from Cree and Amaris, but also I think Scott, you may have gotten more of an intimate understanding of it. It looks like there were 4 or 5 groups working together on prairie dog restoration, for example.
Yeah, the money is really hard to come by, and these people, everybody in that film, if they could be working in the private sector, earning 2 or 3 times what they earn, but they do the work because they love it, and because I mean, how many people get to say, "Oh, what did I do with my summer? I saved 500 lives." I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. So. Every organization finds its funding in a different way. So, for instance, the Crane Trust, a lot of that money is that they have to work with comes from a deal that they made early on when the dams were being built on the Platte River. And environmentalists realized that these dams were absolutely going to destroy all this vital habitat. And so money from the dams was earmarked for crane preservation and for the preservation of other species. So they get money from basically dam power generation revenue. They get money from private donations. The Prairie Dog Coalition is a branch of the Humane Society of the United States, and they also have private funding. And then all that work for the humpback chub, that's through basically the Department of Interior. So those are all like Forest Service and National Park Service employees. So it's primarily government funding. So it's just these organizations just cobble together their money however they can, and they're always pinched. There's never enough to go around.
Given that, I want to turn to the question from, I think it's Danielle. It says, what advice could you give to a young man who is passionate about nature, the environment, and conservation? How can one embrace such a career? I mean, given the challenges of resourcing this kind of conservation effort, Kriya, I wanted to turn it over to you first to answer that question.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah,
So
a young man who's interested, passionate about nature, what advice would you give to someone who wants to do that? How do you start your career?
I mean, well, the biggest question, I'll just put this out there first. For me, it will depends on where he lives, what community he's from, and so forth. But I think the first response I have is reflect on your connection to nature first. If you've already been outside in nature, ask yourself, how does nature feel to you? The second thing that I would suggest too is once you've figured out or thought about the connection that you have with nature, identify ways to volunteer first. You can go to your local forest preserve, park district, find ways to volunteer with the outdoors and nature. And then once you've started volunteering and you really see that you have this passion and connection to nature, young man, I don't know how old you are, try to find if when you're in school, try to find some classes that you can take that can give you some background in biology and working more with plants. But I would encourage you to definitely try to be outdoors as much as possible, because that is going to continue to fuel your passion and connection to nature. Now, if you don't already know about the Jane Goodall Roots and Shoots program, it's a national organization where you can start a group with your family, as small as your family, or 2 or 3 people, where you can do different types of projects, service learning campaigns or projects that shows the care for the environment, for people, animals, and the environment. So that's my immediate thing that I can share with you. But if you're trying to have a career, volunteer, get the experience. Also, try to surround yourself with people that are doing the type of environmental work that you want to do. And Facebook is a big thing, but I'm not trying to promote Facebook. But there are a lot of environmental groups that you can be a part of. So you're building your environmental community. And so eventually you're going to start finding resources everywhere for yourself.
That is really good advice. Amaris, do you have other advice? Say it is a young person in the Chicago region. How best can they get involved?
Sure. And I'll just add to a little bit what Pri said. Understanding a little bit of like your flora and fauna locally. So some of that knowledge base is very handy in early or internship type of opportunities in conservation, and exploring what type of field work. So conservation, there's other type of conservation work, but if you are interested in doing field work, what type of it? Because as we talked a little bit about, the different aspects of like your knowing your conditions, your environment, what kind of positions would you want to be in? Do you want to fly the helicopter? So understanding a little bit about field work comes in handy, and I would also add mentorship. Finding, like, if you have a particular conservationist, someone who works for a particular institution who's studying a species that you're intrigued about, or an ecosystem, finding some mentors or someone that you can follow. And the last thing that I would say is that in terms of trying to test out a position, in terms of conservation, would be that remembering that different aspects of science. So communication and being able to talk to the public about that work that you're doing really makes a difference. So so then that way you can get more support for the conservation work, and then you're able to engage others and make a longer impact. So being able to communicate and speak and find opportunities to talk about the conservation work is also important in starting your career.
So can I share one more thing? You're finished,
Please?
Amaris?
Yeah.
So since you're a young person from Chicago, uh, the Forest Preserve of Cook County, we're hiring youth for our Youth Outdoor Ambassador program. This program will definitely get you connected to the outdoors and to nature. Depending on where you're living or where you're located, you could be working at one of our 6 nature centers where you get to learn how to handle different types of animals. You get to learn where they're from, how they're cared for. You get to learn about the different invasive plants and native plants. So you get to become a junior naturalist. But if it's not the Forest Preserve of Cook County, One Summer Chicago tends to have summer jobs under their umbrella, and some of them are related to the environment. And so these will also be great stepping stones for you to get involved with.
Yeah, so that's great advice. And I wanted
Into
to
that.
ask, oh, I'm sorry, Scott, please.
No, I was just going to say what I observed with the people working in the field was that they had a really interesting combination of like emotional connection with the work that they were doing, but also a kind of rigorous scientific relationship with what they were doing. So they were able to combine both sides of their brains in a really interesting way, and that made them really, really interesting people and really fun to hang out with, because you could talk to them about all kinds of things, about science, or just about their crazy adventures in the wild. So it to all the people considering going into that field, it's great, it's challenging, but it's so fulfilling, and I loved every minute that I got to hang out with the people who are working in the field. So go for it; it's great stuff.
Yeah, that's
And
great. There's
Scott,
actually, oh, no, Cree,
no, I
go.
was going to say, Scott, when you're really passionate about something, it's not hard. It's not that challenging. And even if it is challenging, that passion pushes you through. And that's what makes it, this feel enjoyable because of that passion. So I just wanted to add to what you said because I was feeling what you said.
Scott, that must have been some of what you saw and of those folks who, as you said, they were using huge machines to remake floodplain behavior or helicopters to move fish from one watershed or one stretch of river to another. That's like moving mountains, almost literally.
Um, Yeah, and nobody. Just to continue the thought about people working in the field, very few people that I encountered um, were sort of intense specialists. Everybody could do all kinds of things. So they could participate in wildlife studies, and then they could drive these giant heavy machines, or they could they could hike 20 miles into the backcountry up these, steep hills. but they could be doing science the whole way, and they could be taking notes and field notes. So, yeah, that's I guess it that kind of flexibility that people would bring to the task was really compelling. I have a question for these guys that about, it before I started this film, I would have thought that, urban conservation was like the perfect oxymoron. Like, um, that how can you have conservation in an urban setting? And I looked up North Park, and you're right in the middle of the city. It's really remarkable. So, can you talk a little bit about it? Because this film was sort of set, uh, in places where human impacts were pretty profound, but they were still relatively um, rural for the most part. And I'm kind of interested in how you guys work in a more urban setting, because those human impacts are even more intense where you're working. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit about that.
That is a great question. Amaris, would you start us off?
Sure. Um, in an urban setting, we are still very much dealing with the invasive species, managing for that, and also managing for that balance of human interaction in the space. So we are a preserve within the city, and we still have a lot of visitors and foot traffic. That changes a little bit of that feeling, or the small spring sprouting along the trail that's trying to come out, and maybe people kind of went off trail a little bit. We try to do a lot of engagement around talking to the people about when they're visiting, how to have a ethical visit where you're doing observation, not going off trail. But hey, there's this other place where you can go off trail. But it's in terms of the ecology work. It's buckthorn is one of our invasives. We've got the garlic mustard. It's a yearly thing that continuously we're both using the equipment, the tools, and a lot of the hand and support. It is this new type of balance. We still have an amazing biodiversity, as I was mentioning. In April and May, it's our migratory season of birds, and the incredible amount of warblers that come to just our little spot, like in Chicago, this little gem. We've also seen some rare bird wetland species that have come through. So it's incredible how the animals are adapting, and how we continuously have the human conversation about, even in this gem, we still have to consider that balance and care for the natural world.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Amadis is saying. I mean, the Forest Preserve, I already mentioned, is 70,000 acres of land spread throughout Cook County. And the majority of the most of our Forest Preserve is next to different communities, and we have a lot of human traffic um, throughout the Forest Preserve. And people are using the Forest Preserve for numbers of things, from bird watching to fishing. Some people might be washing their cars, depending on the location. Tons of things. So what we the best thing that we tend to do right now is we really try to engage people, engage the community in what we have to offer. We try to engage the community and help us to develop different preserves, so that we know what they want at that location and what they can uh, benefit from that location. But also, most importantly, we invite them to help us take care of it. So, even if it's with the restoration works, or we do our litter pickup program that spreads throughout the county, uh, any event that we always have some type of, call to action. What kind of work you can do at this location, or what you can do on another day. So we do our best to try to involve the community into the preserve, so that it can be around for another 100 years.
So it's clear that there is a lot of nature restoration, conservation, and things to see, even in an urban space. I think one of the things that is most emblematic about that to me is the journey of the monarch butterfly. We see so many monarchs coming through the city of Chicago. And in fact, at the same time, we see these right now in the spring, we're starting to see so many birds, as Amadis was saying. The city of Chicago, right on the lake, is as important habitat as the places farther out, more rural. And they play this complementary role. I think we're beginning to understand that for species conservation and also for the understanding and enjoyment of people. I think that's what I'm hearing Cree, you've said in so many different ways, in the ways you engage with folks. And I think Amadis, you were saying this is what the North Park Village Center, that's what we provide in the city of Chicago. The Park District offers a real, if not a nature refuge, a place where people can really engage. And I wonder, Scott, uh, hearing about kind of how it works in an urban, or the experiences of Cree and Amadis in urban conservation, I wonder how now you put it back in context, or how you think that relates to the folks who you filmed in the Nature Makers.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think that, one of the things I really came away with was the idea that what we're going to save is what we decide to save in terms of habitat, but also in terms of the species. And we've reached the point now where it's kind of up to us. We kind of get to decide which species stick around and which species are going to vanish. And I mean, I think that's a pretty overwhelming responsibility, but at the same time, I think it's I find it kind of empowering, because it means we can make a difference, we can save species, we can save habitat, we know how important it is, and so it kind of empowers us to to set out to make a difference, because it's now up to us. Like I said before the film, um, you know, there everything happens in a human context now. Everything, like wildlife, is evolving under pressure from humans. They are moving under pressure from humans. They are living and dying under pressure from humans. And so that gives us an ability to decide that we are going to make profound change and keep these species around, because we need to. And I think if there's any lesson to be drawn from the pandemic, we're hopefully on the other side of now, it's that humans cannot exist apart from the natural world. We are bound tightly to nature, and we have to take care of it, not just because it's in our financial interest, but because our lives depend upon it. And then because we have a moral obligation to not be the only species that matter. So that's my reaction.
That was an incredible reaction, a really powerful one. And I think at this time I wanted to note that the explorer and activist Robert Swan said, "The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it." And so, on that note, I have one final question for this esteemed panel. And I want to thank everyone from the audience. So many good questions we got in. I only wish we had time to ask them all. But this one, to see us out, is what actions can people take to be part of the solution? And Cree, would you start us off? I think you might be muted.
And you are right. Um, I mean, it's an action that most people that we've already said that makes a lot of sense to me is that you identify an organization that's actually doing the kind of work that's doing conservation related work and fund them. It could be anything from $5 to $10. A little amount of money can go a long way. And these types of programs is helping to develop our next generation of conservationists. So fund the programs that are doing the work that you also want to do.
Thank you so much for that, Cree. Amaris, would you go next?
Sure. In terms of action, I think there's a lot of work that we can do as individuals to continue our personal ethic with the environment. It's also important for us to advocate for the policies that have protected our plants and wildlife relatives. We should be advocates in those ways as well. And to consider climate change and the urban changes, environmental justice is also key. So we're still facing a lot of injustices and inequities when it comes to climate change impacting the different cities or different ecosystems that are, whether they're islands or just very ecosystems that might not be here. And so it's just really important for us to think about those actions that help with climate change and environmental justice. And that also helps bridge the case for both people and the environment.
Thank you so much for making that important point, Amaris. Scott, last word goes to you on this panel. What actions can people take to be part of the solution?
So if every group that we filmed with worked with volunteers. So they're, as part of the crew that you saw working in the Grand Canyon, some of those people were volunteers. Some of them were retired, and they got to fly in on the helicopter, and they got to do this amazing work with the fish. And there were volunteers working with the prairie dogs. They got to handle the prairie dogs and save prairie dog lives. And so every region of the country has conservation challenges, and if you're interested, you can spend an afternoon, a morning working with some amazing people. So I would highly recommend doing that if you're so inclined. And then the other thing you can do is as Chris said, is donate. And one of the things that I do locally is I just made a monthly pledge to a local wildlife organization whose work I really like. And, you know, the money just goes out of my bank account every month. I don't even have to think about it. And it makes it really easy, and I feel good. And so I'm compelled to sort of keep abreast of what this organization is doing in a way I might not, were I not a regular contributor to what they're doing. So I think those are two things you can really, really easily do. And then there's a lot more, but I think those are sort of the gateway drugs to conservation for me.
I love that. So, as the gateway drugs for conservation, we have for you the next two slides that are going to show on the screen summarize some of the effective actions you can take. These come from our panelists tonight and also from some of our hosting sponsors, partners, and team. So some of these include be with nature, go outside, enjoy the wonders of spring right now if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. You can volunteer, as was just recommended. Find a local organization that is working to protect local species or threatened habitat. You can get to know their work. You can support them in a regular way so they know that they have those reliable resources to rely on. And you can support local, national, or international organizations that are restoring wildlife, such as those featured in the film, the Crane Trust, the Humane Society's Prairie Dog Coalition, the Grand Canyon Conservancy, and the Defenders of Wildlife. If you're in the Chicago region, there are some actions you can take here at home as well. in particular, one of the ones that makes a real difference right now during spring migration for birds. You can support the Lights Out Chicago initiative by turning off your lights in the evening and overnight, particularly around tall buildings that are near the lake during migratory season. You can volunteer here. You heard some opportunities from Cree. You can do it as a steward, actually, for North Park Village Nature Center in the Chicago Park District or the Forest Preserves of Cook County. There's a number of other activities and ways that you can get involved. Finding your local natural areas, making sure that you vote for candidates who support wildlife and the fight against climate change. We encourage you to take those that you can, to take this experience tonight into your next steps in the world. As we close out, I hope that you felt a sense of One Earth's 10th year theme, inspiring change. I hope you felt it come through the film, our discussion, and also how we're coming together to build community around these critical issues. If you would, we'd love you to tell us in the chat about ways that you are ready to take action, to make and to inspire change in others. What do you feel compelled to do right now as a result of tonight's event? And so just looking to see what is being posted. I see gateway drugs for conservation. One of the things we're really looking forward to, however you can get it. Eating mostly vegetables is another one I see from Henry. And I see many thanks for a great experience and a good conversation had. Please do keep adding those comments. Your participation is part of the dialogue that we're trying to catalyze here, and your efforts inspire others. We're grateful for our panelists, for incredible director Scott Saunders, Cree Walls, Amaris Alanis Ribeiro as well, for bringing their stories and to this panel and to tonight and into your living rooms or your at-home offices, wherever you may be, but also to all of you who enlivened the chat, who were part of this experience and who will take it into your next steps. So if you want to learn more about these panelists or stay in touch with their work, there are links on the slide that is posted or will be posted. And you can remember also to continue engaging by tweeting, posting, or sharing about what you just experienced online and on social media. If you found value in today's event, please consider a donation to the One Earth Film Festival and join us again this week, as well as during Earth Week in April, and then throughout the year. Last but not least, I want to say a huge thank you to every one of you, to everyone behind the scenes, the volunteers for the One Earth Film Festival. Let's give one last round of applause in the chat. Thank you again. Hope to see you at another screening.